Well, good afternoon. Welcome to part 4 of our webinar series, Sharing Stories and Building Relationships with the Land. Today is the 4th installment in a 6-part series that runs through June 1st. And my name is Peg Vershawn, and I am the Director of Operations and Programs at CURE, Clean Up the River Environment in Montevideo, Minnesota. The Sharing Stories series grew out of a partnership that was produced by our We Are Water West Central Minnesota project this past year. Our shared goal with the series has been to amplify stories of people who are using conservation practices that have important regenerative potential while reducing the impacts of climate change. These practices improve soil health and water quality. They grow deep connections to the land and those who came before them. These stories are from practitioners, people who have boots on the ground and dirt underneath their fingernails. Together, these storytellers come from different backgrounds, cultures, and generations. We are at a critical moment, and we need to hear perspectives from path builders who are catalyzing change for themselves and their communities. Today, we welcome Mark Erickson from the Boss Ridge Ranch near Morris, Minnesota. Mark is going to walk us through what has led he and his family to transition from farming to ranching. What is unique about Mark's journey is that he not only had to get his family on board with this transition to ranching, but he also had to persuade other landowners to allow him to convert their land to pasture to graze his animals on. We're going to start today with a brief video introduction that was filmed for us by a partner named Brian DeVore from Land Stewardship Project. He went out and he visited with all of the participants in our series, and he shot some video out on their fields so that you as the viewer would get an opportunity to see our participants out in the natural landscape. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to watch this brief video.
So I'm Mark Erickson, and the operation that we've named our ranch here the Boss Ridge Ranch. The boss refers to the cattle, and we live on the Continental Divide, so that's where the ridge comes from. And we raise grass-fed, grass-finished beef is our sole product on the farm here, along with some chickens and other food products. And so I started conventionally farming here in 1994, doing conventional corn, soybeans, wheat, and alfalfa. And in the mid to late 2000s, grain prices were pretty poor, so we transitioned the farm to all grass, all beef. Beginning in 2007, and by 2010 we were completely converted to all grass and all beef. And so that's kind of been the history of the farm. And so we've been doing this grass-fed thing since '98. We started experimenting with it, and have been doing it pretty much full time then since 2010. So we've had up to 6 landlords over the years, and right now currently we're dealing with 4 different landowners. And to convert this all to grass, of course they had to agree that it was going to be a long-term thing because of the fencing, and we have 40 some watering locations spread throughout the farm so that the cattle can drink fresh well water basically at all times. And so it's fairly extensive infrastructure required, and so it's a long-term commitment. And so we had the landowners out here when we were going to start doing this, and had a family meeting with them, and explained to them what we were going to do, and they all agreed to go along with the crazy plan. So now we're converted to all grass, and it's taken about, it takes almost 10 years for the grasses to really, the land to reestablish itself as grassland, which of course, this is what it was before, was the tall grass prairie. And of course, as a operator, you have to get re-educated in how you think about so many different things to make this work. And so we've planted this in 2014. We reestablished 20 acres of the 400 that we farm as native prairie, as kind of an experiment to add diversity to the grazing mix, especially for the finishing cattle. And so that's why we have this 20 acres in this corner of the 80 here that's restored native prairie.
Wow. It feels good to be at this point where we've been working on the series now, and we're halfway through. This is our fourth video in the series. I just want to thank you, Mark, for being with us today. You know, you in the video refer to yourself as an operator because you have a unique setup compared to the other participants in our series. Could you talk a little bit about how much land you own and how much you actually lease for your operation?
So we don't actually own any land, so all the land that we operate is leased from several different landlords. And so when we moved here in '94, Delano and Linda Meyer have the base of the operation, and then the Gay Farms land was part of the operation, and then also Gordon Prickett has a 80 that adjoins here, and then my mother-in-law's Evelyn Rash and her son David is managing that for her. So we have 80 acres near Morris of grassland as well. So altogether we've got about 450 acres that's in grassland now, and there used to be 50 acres of permanent pasture when we started, and then as we went along, we started converting steep hillsides and small uneven fields to the grassland first, and then we eventually, the good tillable land we did as well.
Great. So in the introductory segment, we heard you refer a little bit or talk a little bit about the farm crisis and maybe the influence that the farm crisis had on your decision to transition from conventional farming to your grazing operation. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you know, with extended period of low prices, especially what there was from the late 1990s through 2008, our machinery was getting older, and it didn't seem like there was enough profit there to replace the machinery with new, more modern machinery. And so that's why we looked for a different way so that we could stay in the farming business. And with the size of operation we are, you can't justify massive machinery costs, and but you need to stay with the times and have equipment that's capable.
So when you think about this transition, coming from a farming background, because your family farmed, you grew up in a farming background, um, how hard was it for you to really think of yourself differently from being a farmer to a rancher? Like, who did you have to convince first, and who was the hardest one to convince in this process?
Oh, well, you have to convince yourself because changing the way you do things and the uh, going on a different track than what the current paradigms are is it's difficult because you tend to you start off doing things differently and then you've been raised with conventional thinking. So that's one of the struggles is you wind up in the middle. Your part of your operation is the new ways that you've learned to adapt and the new technologies that seem to be successful, especially for a moderate sized farm. But then you're always pulled back into your conventional way of thinking because that's the way what you learned in tech school and management for many years. And so that's the difficult part because you have when you're caught in the middle, you have the the expenses of both types of farming, and so it'd be like going to organic farming. You have to pull the shade and move to the new system, and that's a hard thing to do, is to change your conventional type thinking.
So, who did you go to for support, and where did you learn about, the new ways of thinking about managing soil health? Because I really think that you were ahead of your time. I'm sure your neighbors were looking over the fields and wondering what you were doing, wondering, if you were gonna be successful at it. So, who were those influences in your network or w that really helped you take the leap?
Well, probably one of the first steps was when I started going to the Minnesota Grazing Conference back in 2000, and that's changed to the Organic Conference now, and that's been a tremendous resource over the years. And of course, the Sustainable Farming Association and Land Stewardship Project, and other leaders like Laverne and Mary Jo Forbord and Don Bev Struxness. I looked at their operations when I was starting, and I saw that they were actually doing this and making it work, and it looked, the landscape looked and made sense, uh, because we struggled here with through some wet years and not enough tile. And so what happens is you've got drowned out spots on the other side of good cropland. And so now you have to drive across good cropland to go try and clean the weeds up in this drowned out spot. And none of those spots exist on the farm anymore. There's nothing ever drowns out
Mhm.
because of the changes that we've made. And we've done that without having to put in tile. We started putting in some tile, but the cost of it, that was back in the late 90s. And the cost of it with low grain prices at that time just did not make sense. And so uh, so so with that kind of influence, if you're going to be a moderate sized farm, you've got to really watch your P's and Q's if you're going to make enough money to survive. And that's when you have a family that you'd like to see involved in it, and survival is important. And
I think one of the things I'm hearing you talk a little bit about is how weather has impacted that conversion from conventional farmland to pasture. And the work we do at Cure is climate, energy, and water. So we're really interested at the nexus of agriculture and climate and the challenges that you are currently facing related to soil health and water management on your property. Can you talk a little bit about that?
well, the the best way to manage grasslands, and one of the struggles when you're starting that out, is you need to plant the grass and then let it rest and grow strong and get a good root system. But at the same time, you need to get an income off of that land while it's transitioning. And that is a real struggle because you're wanting to leave these plants grow, but you need to harvest them with the cows grazing them. And so that's a trade-off. By the harder you graze them, the longer it's going to take the land to build the soil organic matter and the root structure needed for healthy grassland. And along with all of that goes the healthy grassland and the good, strong soil biology also releases the minerals. That's one thing that we've seen in the test, the available minerals and that are released by the soil biology have improved immensely over time. But it's taken 10 years, and if we were to have rested it more and grazed it more intensely when we started it, we would have probably been able to do that in 3 to 5 years instead of 10 years. And but the last couple of years, we really noticed the difference in the grass productivity, and the cattle seem to be a much healthier and more resilient, and the water holding ability of the soil, because our soil is now approaching 7% organic matter, so we have much better water holding ability. The water doesn't, when it rains, the water doesn't pass on through the soil structure. It's held there so that the grasses don't go dormant when it gets dry and hot. And that's very beneficial. But the only way you get to that point is by having those healthy grass structures, the diversity, and the soil organic matter, and the rest of the biology working like it's supposed to.
Yeah, I would agree. I think one of the things that we learn about the grasses is that, for the viewers who might not be familiar, is with the prairie grasses, and actually all grasses, typically what you see above ground is about a third of the overall plant, because there's about 2/3 that's down below the ground in that soil that Mark's talking about, where they're the you're building the soil health and the ability to have live microorganisms that are building that soil health. But not only that, is that allows, when we have a rain event, because with climate change, it's not uncommon for us to get a 4-inch rain in a short amount of time. In a conventional farm field, you might see that water just sit on top of the soil, unless it's tiled significantly. In a nice pasture like the ones you see on Mark's property, the soil will just soak up that water and hold it and allow it to stay there and be accessed over time for the grasses, to keep his production up for his feed. And I think that's an important thing that a lot of people don't realize. Mark, yesterday when we were visiting a little bit, you told me two things that I thought were really fascinating and I was really more curious about that I think our viewers would be interested in is you told me about your testing when you first started this process and you were curious to know if raising your steers on grass-fed pasture made a difference versus feeding them grain. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, we sent some uh, meat samples into the Agricultural Utilization and Research Institute and had them tested when we first started. Because before I went off on this unusual production method, I wanted to know if some of the claims that they said were actually true. And I was really enthused by the way the tests came back. The high levels of omega-3 that were in the meat. So the ratio was about 1.5 to 1 omega-6 to 1.5 parts omega-6 to 1 part omega-3, which is supposedly for your healthiest diet is you want to be close to a 1-to-1 omega balance. And of course, once you feed animals a lot of grain, you get at least 30 times as much omega-6
My brother's on it.
as you do in grass-fed animals. And so that really encouraged me. And so they test all the fat components. And the other thing that I noticed was the fat components seem to be very balanced, because there's like 20 different components of fat that they test.
I think that's really amazing, and it's important when we think about healthy diets and when we think about animals, what they're designed to eat, because a lot of times our current production methods of food alter the natural sequence of food alignment for the animals that we're using in our production. And so when you were sharing that yesterday, I thought that that was a really important thing, and that there are ways to get your meat tested and find out what those ratios look like for yourself as a farmer. So I thought that was really a great thing. And then yesterday, you also were sharing with us some things that you've been thinking more hard about or more serious about related to your grazing methods. And we were talking mostly about, I had asked you the question about how do you end up having to interseed sometimes your pastures to make them a little bit more robust. And we got off talking about the quality of the pasture and the forage that comes up and how the things that you're experimenting with right now. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you always make mistakes, and the weather goes against you. And when you've got a large group of cattle and it rains for 3 weeks, they are going to damage your pasture. There's no doubt about it. And so we used to fix some of that in thin areas by no tilling and adding in new grasses. But of course, that helps. But when you were planting a new little seedling into an established pasture, it has a real tough time competing. So, because when you add those plants in, you're doing it with a no-till drill. So it's all about the timing. And in nature, timing is everything. And so when you do it with a no-till drill, you have to go get the no-till drill and rent it, and you have to seed it and then take it back. And so the timing is when you've got the seed, when you've got the time, when the ground is dry enough, and when you're able to rent the drill. In nature, if you can let your pastures, your healthy pastures, reseed themselves, then the seeding gets done by nature's timing. And I believe that's a much more effective way to do that. So to allow nature to reseed those pastures, there's two things that can happen. You can graze your pastures too hard, and the only plants that are left that get big enough to go to seed are the ones that the cattle don't like. So you don't want the results of that in your pasture. So what we've done more of, and they're experimenting with it. We start out in the spring by what I call flash grazing. So moving the cattle quickly through and try to remove like 2/3 of the seed head, so that you can maintain quality in your pasture, but that you move them quick enough so that you leave some of the good plants to be able to go to seed, and don't bring them cattle back until the seed is matured. And so using strategies to allow your pastures to, the healthy plants that you desire, the desirable plants to reseed themselves by nature's way, that's just another one of those things that we're all finding out, is discovering how we can work with nature to make that work, instead of trying to force our own way onto it. And because when we try to do it our way, it's more expensive and not as effective.
You know, your comments about following nature's way. You also talked a little bit about that with your herd and calving. Can you speak to that a little bit and share your wisdom over time related to calving?
Well, when we started calving, this is an example of the conventional thinking. So we started in '94 with the heifers calved January 24th, and it was 24 below several nights when we were calving those heifers. And so the next year we moved to February 9th, and then we moved about 10 days ahead every year for many years. And then we kind of settled on calving in April. But, like this April's a perfect example. It's still a hard time to calve, even in April. And in nature, the bison and the deer, they have their young in late April, May, and June. And so last year, hopefully this all works, and I think it will. We changed our calving dates now, so we're going to calve in May and June. And we also tried fall calving, so we split the herd and did fall calving, but that added so much complexity because you're weaning twice a year, you're working the calves 4 times a year. It just adds too much complexity to it. And then you're going against nature again, because in the fall, all them coyote pups need to learn how to kill something. And it turns out killing baby calves is, and so we've got from our fall calving herd yet, which was 2 years ago, we pretty much quit that. We've still got some short-tailed calves in the herd that the coyotes chewed the tails right off them. And so I'm really determined to stick with this May and June calving now, and I believe that's going to be very beneficial. And again, it will reduce cost and reduce complexity, so that we can spend our time on other more important things.
Well, I think nature has a way of gently reminding us that we're either working too hard or we're working against ourselves, right? And that's a perfect example of looking to nature to realize that you're out of alignment, and maybe it would make more sense to think differently. And you know, I'm sure there's reasons why people calve in February, March, and April. If you're a conventional farmer, you need to be out in the fields, but you're in a unique situation now that you don't have to be out in the fields because you've got your pasture, that it does make more sense, and less work for you. So that I think that that's a win-win in your case. I'm going to steer the conversation back a little bit more to this unique thing that you bring to the mix, and that's this relationship that you have with multiple landowners to allow you to graze their property, and you really you had to find people that were willing to rent to you and allow you to convert their land to pasture so that it was good forage for your animals. And I think that our listeners today are a little bit curious about maybe the process that you went through. Um, you know, you talked a little bit about some of the folks that you work with, and you know, whether you met them through other networks or family, but I'm guessing that you had to strategize a little bit and maybe invite them out. Could you talk a little bit about that process that you went through to cultivate them, to think about conservation, to think about going back to pasture?
Well, the landowners have been through quite a bit of agricultural history, so they experienced the wonders of the late 70s and early 80s, and then the disaster as the 80s progressed, and farmers got in big financial problems, and so uh, you, they have a great deal of experience, and I think all of them. I was just fortunate enough to get involved with this group when Delano and Linda went to be missionaries. That we got to work with this group of landowners, and Delano had always been a conservation minded, and so that's part of it. Is this group of landowners has always been, to my way of thinking, conservation minded, and I think they have a land use ethic. They like to see the family on the land, and so that requires a commitment. And so back in there's been various times over the history that in the early 2000s, I let some of the tillable land go from one of the landowners because of the equipment issue and so on, and I kept the rough land and the highly erodible hillsides and so on, and have made that into permanent pasture. So the land use on that part of the land is probably what it should be. And so when we started doing that, so we started that process actually must have been around 2000. And so then you're going to make these major decisions. How do you do this? And I had decided that I wasn't going to buy new equipment. And so it was more or less, we either do this intensive pasture grazing thing, or we quit. And so I had a meeting with them, and Gordon and Jean and Jim Gay and Delno and Linda, and they were all here. We spent the day, and we went out, and I showed them where I intended to put the fences and what I intended to do with the water and so on, and they had to sign the commitment that this was going to remain in pasture for 20 years. And so I got a very positive response from that, and that's how we came to move forward with all of this.
You were building the relationship with them, and not only talking to them about the process, but you actually brought them out to look at the process. And I think that aesthetic of actually being out in the field and being on the spot, it makes it hard not to want to do what's best for the land, because I think that's what you're really doing. You're thinking about the land and the water and the legacy that you're leaving. And you talk about the generations or the decades of challenges and fighting to maintain the land and maintain a way of life. And in some ways, you're just surrendering to nature in many ways, and trying to do what's best for nature. And if you take care of the natural world will take care of you. And that seems to be what's happening for you and your family, is the hard work that you've put in to protect the land and the water is really, taking care of you and the animals in return. I think it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. It's really evident by listening to you talk. One of the other things yesterday that was interesting to me was some of the new things that you're experimenting with related to water. You talked about how you started with permanent water holes on your property, and what you're moving to now. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, when we started putting the fences and grazing systems in, we were doing what was called rotational grazing. So that is basically a set number of paddocks and a water tank in each paddock, a permanent water tank in each paddock. But part of what happens is the most of the manure gets in the area of the water tank, and the grass gets beat up the worst there. And so we're moving away from the permanent watering locations and adding extra water lines so that we can move the tanks more, so we can concentrate my goal is to have no black dirt, no mud holes by water tanks, so that it's all in healthy pasture plants. And to do that, you need to spread those move those watering locations so that the land is very resilient. If you give it a chance, you can beat it up, but if you give it but if you don't do it for too long and you give it a chance to rest and recuperate, it comes back unbelievably well. In fact, in the areas that are trampled the worst will become the healthiest if they're not trampled for a long period of time. So that if the cattle are only there for 2 days or so, and then they're moved, those areas may look like a plowed field in a rainy event, but 6 weeks later, they will be the best grassland you have. And so the ability of plants to recover if you keep the cattle moving. And then, of course, the newest way of grazing now is using less fencing, and actually is herding cattle. And but we're not ready yet to go out and stand there and keep the cattle standing where we want them by herding every day yet. So we're going to use the watering source and the mineral source along with fencing to try to keep these cattle concentrated in the areas they need to be, instead of going by a set grazing plan. The new way of doing it is to keep moving the cattle to the place on the farm that they need to be today. And so that's it's a changing idea all the time. And but by doing that, you will again increase your production of beef and improve the quality of your your grasses and your animals.
You know, Mark, every time I listen to you talk, I learn something new. It's kind of interesting, and I really appreciate everything you're sharing today. One of the things we have the ability to do is to take questions from the participants. And so if you're interested in submitting a question to Mark, you can go to the chat and type it in, and I'll try to get to as many of those as I can. There are a few questions there. So are you up for that, Mark? Can I ask you a couple?
Sure.
Okay. So one of the questions comes from Troy, and he wants to know how you've been able to involve your family in the work on your ranch over time.
Well, they've always been a key part of it. And so I have a daughter and 3 sons. I have 10 grandsons and a granddaughter. And they range from a couple months old to 28. And so there's always somebody changing what they're doing and at different stages and so on. But they've always been a key part of it. And, this is part of what having an operation like this requires lots of help sometimes. And of course, the good part of that is when you have help here, you're together and you're doing things together. And so, Andy has been working with me for several years, and it's gotten to the point where now I have to try to train myself to just step back and let him sort the cattle, because he can do it better than I can. And of course, having Adam working with the soil and water, he's always adds a level of understanding that, it's, having someone who understands what you're doing is very important. And so he adds a level of confidence and helps me see new things and think of new ways to do things. And then of course, all the other family members each make their own contributions. And of course, my wife, Deb, she has to keep this all organized and keep this mob fed when all this work is happening. So that's it's all the way I think life should be. And so if we can, the main thing is to survive so we can continue to do this and figure out the right way to do it. And that's the difficult part.
You've talked about some of the programs that you've used. You talk about having Adam at the SWCD, which he in Stevens County, which he actually, might have a line to new programs that are coming out. But are there other agencies or programs that you've used outside of the SWCD that have helped you or the other landowners transition the land?
Well, of course, the NRCS EQIP program has been really, really helpful, and their expertise is so important, because they have many really dedicated employees that I feel, and their expertise has been really helpful, and of course they're the cost share and putting in fences and watering and is you'd have a hard time doing that on your own. And we're doing some of that on our own now, because we've figured out how to make fences cheaper than we used to, and we have the equipment and tools to do it. So and then of course the Land Stewardship and the Sustainable Farming Association and the Minnesota Organic Conference, conferences that they put on and the field days that they put on are absolutely essential to shorten up your learning curve, because that's the hardest part of all of this is gaining an understanding and having the confidence to go forward with changes. It's just like cover crops. We're just starting to go back to using some annual cover crops as a way to improve our poorest pastures. And so, you know, that takes getting that level of understanding, which you get from working with others who are trying different things. You know, how many things do you have to try to have one great success? You know, more businesses fail every year than become successful. And it's the same thing with trying new things. You have to have all of these people out there trying these new things and then saying that didn't work, and then why didn't it work? You know, the first time we did cover crops, first couple of times, were a complete failure. And so I was at a field day over at Jim Wolf's, and he said the way that you make cover crops work is you manage them with the same intent and passion as you do a cash corn crop. So you think about that. Most people, when they're going to do a cover crop, well, they'll throw some seed out there and see if it grows. No, you have to plant it at the right depth. You have to make sure it has the fertility and the water to grow. And you have to nurse it along and help plant it at the right time. And so that's where you learn these things, is at these events. You learn, shortens your learning curve.
I continually feel like the thread that we get through these webinars is building relationships with your neighbors and those organizations out there that you know, that you listed off certainly help bring people together and share good ideas, problem solve. I also hear a lot of adventure or initiative, being willing to try new things and being open-minded, because I think sometimes people can worry about what other people are thinking they're doing. And certainly through our relationship of getting to know you, I've really appreciated that you have a linear side to what you're doing. You analyze, you look at things, you measure them, you determine the financial viability, you know, whether that's the influence of your father. You had mentioned, I think yesterday, I don't know if the viewers know, but your dad was an accountant and gave you some maybe number skills that might not always be available to people in this work. Or at least just the growing up with someone that's a numbers person gives you the idea about how to process information and weigh and balance the pros and cons to decide if you're going to take that risk. So I've really appreciated that sense of adventure. We're kind of coming towards the end of our time today, so I want to be able to just take a minute to thank you and your family, Mark, for sharing your story with us. I also would like to thank a couple of our partners in this work. This project really came about through a grant opportunity through the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships at the University of Minnesota Extensions. And Troy Goodnow from the Office of Sustainability at the University of Minnesota Morris was one of our We Are Water partners. And he said there's this opportunity maybe to look at how water in our watershed is being managed. And, you know, we know that the quality of water and how water moves on the land is deeply impacted by agriculture. And this was an opportunity to reach out to some partners in the watershed that are doing things a little bit differently than maybe their neighbors. And so, Mark, you certainly are one of those people that we wanted to lift up and tell the story about how you work with being an operator and converting conventional land to pasture. Another partner in this work is Judy Johnston at the Stevens County Soil Water District. Mark referenced Land Stewardship a couple times. Brian DeVore actually went out and filmed all of the segments for our webinar series, and Robin Moore from the Montevideo office of Land Stewardship Project. She was part of thinking about this concept and helping us develop it. We want to thank all of you for joining us today. There are over 35 people on the call today, so we appreciate for you spending your lunch hour with us. We want to be sure to invite you to join us on Tuesday, May 11th, where Carrie Redden from the 12 Tails Farm near Chicago, Minnesota, is going to share her story with us. These webinars are going to be available to you through either the Cure website or the Cure YouTube channel. They'll be stored there, and we'll do a little bit of editing of today's webinar, and the previous 3 webinars are there for you to check out and share and view if you'd like. We just want to thank you, Mark, once again, and your family for opening up your farm, ranch to us, and we wish you the best of luck, and we'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and have the great rest of your day. We'll see you on the 11th. Bye-bye.
Yep, thank you as well.